Behavioral Sciences Lecture 5, Motivation, Emotion, and Stress. What is motivation? Motivation is the purpose or driving force behind actions, and there are two kinds. The first is intrinsic motivation, which is the motivation that comes from yourself. Examples of this are self-improvement or personal enjoyment. Extrinsic motivation are motivations through external forces, for example, rewards or avoiding behavior. An example of a distinction between these two would be selecting a college major. If you chose a major that made you happy, that would be something that we would consider intrinsic motivation. If you chose something that made a lot of money, though, that would be an extrinsic motivation. There is no concise theory on where motivation comes from. So, for this next portion, let's go ahead and look at a couple takes on where motivation comes from. Instincts are innate, fixed patterns of behavior in response to a stimuli. These are evolutionarily programmed, so largely based on natural progression. In the instinct theory, motivation is simply an expression of your natural programming. The arousal theory states that behaviors and actions are done in order to maintain arousal. Arousal is noted as the state of being awake and reactive to a stimulus at optimal levels. Note that performance is optimal at moderate arousal levels, so keep that in mind when you're taking your test. The drive reductions theory states that motivations arise from the desire to eliminate drives. Drives are internal states of tension that propagate behaviors based on goals. So an example of this is, if you were hungry, you would have a drive to eat. The drive reduction theory states that you would be motivated to go find food. Other more complicated concepts include if you had a desire to be the best athlete. Well, the drive reduction theory would state that this desire to be the best would motivate you to train. Need-based theories state that motivation comes from the need to survive. Maslow's hierarchy of need is one of the more commonly accepted divisions of how we prioritize needs. Physiological needs at the base of the pyramid are the highest priority. These are the bare minimum essentials that we need to survive. Safety and security is next in line, the next being love and belonging, followed by self-esteem and self-actualization. As you go up the pyramid, the prioritization goes down. Self-determination theory is another need-based theory, and it emphasizes the role of three universal needs. The first is autonomy, which is the need to be in control of oneself. Competence is the need to complete and excel. So basically, you need to complete your tasks, and you need to do well at them. Relatedness, the need to feel accepted and wanted in relationships. These three are the three universal needs that self-determination theory revolves around. The incentive theory states that motivation is a desire to pursue rewards and avoid punishment. This ought to sound familiar. Recall that in the last chapter, we talked about operant conditioning, and this incentive theory is largely based on those tenets. The expectancy value theory basically states that the amount of motivation for a task is based on the individual's expectation of success and how much that success is valued. So it's a effort to yield ratio, more or less. The opponent process theory is a motivational theory that stems from biology. Basically, as something occurs, you counteract its effects. So, in the case of drugs, as you use drugs and as that use increases, the body will counteract its effects, which will lead to tolerance. Take this drug away, and it'll lead to withdrawal symptoms. This can be as minor as a headache from not getting your morning coffee to pretty incredible heroin withdrawal symptoms. Lastly, there's sexual motivation, which is another motivational theory that stems from biological factors. It states that behaviors and actions are driven by sexual needs and desires. This is related to hormones, cultural, and social factors. If you haven't caught on by now, this is largely a Freudian theory. Now that we've covered motivation, let's go into the next portion, emotions. For starters, what are emotions? They are a state of mind or feeling that is subjectively experienced. No two individuals will sense or feel emotions in the same way. They are based on circumstance, mood, and relationships. The three components of emotions are cognitive, behavioral, and physiological. The 7 universal emotions are happiness, sadness, contempt, surprise, fear, disgust, and anger. If you're interested in a very good movie about emotions, I would recommend watching Inside Out. There are some theories on emotions, but none of them really can say for sure that they have it down. The James Lange theory states that the nervous system arousal leads to the cognitive emotional response. So an example of this is if you were to see a bear, your heart would race, adrenaline would kick in, and you'd experience fear. Your body would know to experience fear because of the fact that you have adrenaline going through your system, a bear in your sensory vision, and the fact that your heart is racing. A different take on this is the Cannon-Bard theory, which states that the simultaneous arousal of the nervous system and cognitive response leads to action. So going back to the bear analogy, your physiological response and your emotional response would occur simultaneously. So you would sense the emotion at the same time that your body released the hormones and started to accelerate the heart rate. The Schachter-Singer theory states that the nervous system arousal and the interpretation of context leads to a cognitive response. Note, this is the only theory that takes into account context. So an example of this would be, going back to the bear analogy that is, if you were to see a bear out in the wild while you were camping, you would interpret the context and react accordingly. However, if you were to see that same bear in a zoo, you would take into account the context and probably have a very different response. We can't talk about emotions without talking about the limbic system, which is the primary nervous system component that is involved in emotional experience. The amygdala is involved with attention and fear. It helps interpret in facial expressions as well. It also is part of the intrinsic memory system for emotional memory. The thalamus is the sensory processing information. Sensory information goes through this part of the brain while it goes to other portions. The hypothalamus releases the neurotransmitters that affect your mood and arousal. And lastly, the hippocampus creates the long-term explicit memories. The prefrontal cortex. This is arguably the part of the brain that makes us human, or gives us the characteristics that would qualify us as human. It's involved in planning, expressing personality, and making decisions. Different portions of it also have various functions. The ventral prefrontal cortex is critical for experiencing emotions. The ventral medial prefrontal cortex controls emotional responses from the amygdala. In our last bit of this lecture, let's talk about stress. Stress is the physiological and cognitive response to challenges in life. This can also be a response to changes in life, which often cause stress as well. A stressor is anything that leads to stress. It can be distress, or bad stress, or eustress, good stress. Do note that anything, positive or negative, can cause stress. There are 2 stages of stress appraisal. The first is the primary appraisal, which is the classifying of a potential stressor as irrelevant, benign, positive, or stressful. So an example of this is if a stressor came up. An example would be a test. You would have to immediately classify it as whether it is good, bad, or just a thing. The next part of the appraisal process is secondary, which is the direct evaluation of the organism can cope with the stress. It's based on harm, threat, and challenge. So going back to the test, if you were to be presented with stress in the form of a impending exam, you would appraise it as whether or not it would be challenging or if you could manage it. So if you studied a lot or if you feel on top of your material, you would probably respond to that stressor differently than if you did not feel ready for it. There are general adaptations to stress, and it comes in three forms. The first is alarm, which is the initial reaction to stress. The second is resistance, or fighting of the stressor. The last is exhaustion, which is when the body can no longer withstand the stress. It leads to panic and an eventual breakdown. Hopefully, you don't get to this point. At stage 1, your body will mobilize its resources. So hormones will be pumping, resources will be utilized, and you will in general prepare to fight. In phase 2, you're actively fighting. Now hopefully, you'll stay in this phase, because in phase 3, you no longer have the resources or energy to continue fighting, and this leads to harmful effects. Speaking of harmful effects, there have been shown to be physiological effects of chronic stress, which you can see in the picture below. Keep this in mind, because too much stress or prolonged stress will have harmful physiological effects. Which leads us to the next bit, which is stress management. As future med students, you need a way to cope with stress, and these methods can be adaptive or maladaptive. An adaptive way to manage stress would be to exercise. A maladaptive form would be drug use. Choose wisely, because how you manage stress is largely going to become habitual and affect you later on. There are components of stress management: psychological, behavioral, and emotional. Psychological components include how you appraise stress cognitively. Behavioral is how your behaviors react to this stress. And the emotional components are how you, on an emotional level, handle it. That'll do it for this lecture. Please join us in the next one.